What if I told you that some blind people could see? Sure, it's not the same as what you and I would interpret as seeing, but neuroscientists discovered this concept called blindsight that I believe is actually very important when it comes to reality shifting and traversing the different interdimensional layers. But I'll get to that in the later part. Let's go back to blindsight. So, when researchers were working with patients that had any sort of significant damage to the visual cortex, what they found is that there was almost like this backup system that even though they were completely blind, they could detect sometimes movement in this gray, almost like pixelated way, or they could detect the movement of high contrast objects. It was fuzzy, hard to really make out, but they found that statistically speaking, they could actually detect moving objects with certain features. And sometimes they would automatically look towards an object in the room that had just been placed there or moved, but they wouldn't have any awareness. Get this, they wouldn't have any awareness that they were orienting with their eyes or turning their head. They wouldn't understand why. And that's because this backup system, a subcortical visual backup system, has additional fiber connections that are not part of the normal visual system. And as a result, there's this whole level of unconscious processing that happens under the hood. And this was revealed in people who were blind when they didn't have their normal system online and functioning. And this is important because when I first started studying the research of consciousness, when I got my PhD in neuroscience, I did not study consciousness. So I've had to educate myself on what was out there. And I've only dipped my toes in the water in terms of reading the scientific papers. But what I found interesting is that there's almost this disagreement of what consciousness is and what it isn't. And so when I talk about consciousness in the context of scientific literature, it's important to understand that very often the way that scientists use that term is very, very different than those who have had a spiritual awakening, those that are on the mystic path. And so in this particular context, what this means is that beyond the person's awareness, they are processing visual information and responding to it, and without understanding why they are reacting a certain way. And this reminds me of the literature on intuition, where you can flash images in people's eyes very, very quickly, where they won't know that they're being flashed these images, but their body still reacts. Particularly if it's any sort of negative or frightful image, the hands will get sweaty, the palms will get sweaty, the heart will race a little bit. And this happens at this unconscious, also subcortical level, meaning outside of the bounds of the operating system that's keeping tabs on everything. So if you were to ask a person why their palms were sweaty, if they were in one of these experiments, they would have no idea, because they would be focused on looking at a computer screen, trying to click a mouse whenever they saw a certain type of image, completely oblivious to the fact that they were also being shown in very, very rapid succession other stimuli, other images. And so they're clicking on the mouse whenever they see puppies. And if a researcher says, hey, why do you think your heart rate is going up? Why do you think your hands are sweaty? They might come up with an answer that makes sense to them. This is also what the brain does. It goes back to Dr. Kazanaga's work that I talked about in the last episode in the split brain patients, but I didn't talk about this aspect of it. We have an interpreter function in our brains that when we don't understand something, it doesn't matter. We make it up. We literally make up stories to explain everything. And even in the absence of genuine education and actual data, our mind will concoct the craziest explanations, and in fact does so instinctively, so naturally, and so quickly. It's almost as though we need reality to make sense. And when it does not make sense, don't worry. You have an interpreter function in your brain that will patch things over. And it can be the most illogical, irrational, or even the most logical or rational explanation that is completely wrong. And you'll buy it, and you will feel better. It is the absence of knowing that actually plagues people and keeps them up at night, almost as though we have to always be making sense of the world. And when it does not make sense, we fill in the blanks. And it's like those Mad Libs, if you ever did one of those, where it's word salad when you look at the whole picture. But the brain is just like, I'm just going to fill this in. And so I believe that when people are awakening to things like reality shifting, they are perceiving these changes. I see TikToks all the time, not all the time, but often, where people are like, I don't know, man, something's weird. I can't explain it. Something's weird with the sun. I don't get it. Something's changed. Something's weird with time. Something's weird with the logos. Something's weird with the Mandela effect. Something's weird with the family. Something's weird after my NDE. And so all they know is that something is weird. It's like their palms are sweaty. And they're figuring out something's happening, but they don't know what exactly. And so they come up with a lot of explanations. And depending on where they are dipping their toes into certain pools, sometimes these explanations can be quite frightening, related to a they with a capital T, and narratives that start with a capital C. That can get you shadow banned if you talk about it too much. Alternatively, others say it's CERN's fault. I'm playing around with the God particle again, smashing things together, opening up wormholes. Those damn scientists. And there's this whole plethora of explanations, actually. And then you get to those who are awakened to reality shifting, who have experienced different reality layers and are training themselves on how to become accustomed to it. And they might be like, yeah, all of those exist. We live in a multiverse. Why are you driving your avatar to that one? God, man, you signing up for that one? Some of them are irresistible, though. And so it's like a moth to a flame, particularly if you have any sort of archetype embedded in you that is active with some of those hero-villain dynamics. And so as a result, what I believe happens is that there's this subconscious threshold, perhaps even subcortical threshold, where bits of information about reality and the fluidity of it are being processed. But when the person doesn't have a framework of understanding for it, they start to mad lib their experiences. And who knows, reality shifting frameworks could be another version of mad libbing. We actually don't know. It could be that there is some other explanation that is outside of our awareness, our medical awareness, scientific awareness. And the possibilities are endless there. I have several theories of alternatives, but it's not helpful to go into it now. So we create these structures of explanations and understandings. And whenever something weird happens, if you are coming from a materialist reductionist world, then you're mostly closed to any sort of alternative explanations. There is only one world, and that's it. And everything else is just faulty technology, ADHD, and crazy people. And anything outside of those buckets remains largely unexplained. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but when there are not buckets to put things into, most of the time people just go on about their day, unless it really, really plagues them. And it might, depending on how much has changed and how many things are changing. That is part of the awakening process. When enough of those things start to get your attention, eventually you start to look for answers. Where do you go for answers? Most people go to friends, family, Google, mainstream culture. Some people start going off the grid and start looking into other avenues. And this is where it can get a little tricky, because these are all stories. They're all stories. They're all explanations. And potentially they're all mad libs. Just word salads and concepts that are kind of loosely patched together with Scotch tape, intellectually speaking. And depending on the conviction and believability of the people that are presenting these frameworks, these collection of ideas that are loosely taped together, it can have a lasting impact on generations to come. And what happens is that when enough people start to pick it up and internalize it as a belief system, then we can collectively start to agree on it. And then perhaps we can collectively start to manifest it, regardless of whether or not it's true. From the beginning, we could actually make it true. And if you are not a materialist reductionist, then perhaps you are already exposed to different frameworks of understanding. Perhaps you already believe in a multidimensional existence. And perhaps you believe that there are options, and you're not necessarily nihilist, and that after you pass, that's just the end point of view. And there's many, many options to sample from there as well. Many that have been taken from eons previously, whereas the materialist reductionist perspective is largely derived from modern day science and mathematics and medicine. And so we're talking the last couple hundred years. But those that dabble in any sort of esoteric arts or spiritual Eastern philosophies, you will be sampling from frameworks that have been around for thousands of years. And at some point, we have to dig into that a little bit too. Because the people that created those frameworks created them at a position of space-time where there were not things like computers. There were not things like CERN. There was not advanced technology. There was pretty much just you and me and them and some people meditating on a mountain, talking to God. In many different forms. But what if God was not how they conceptualized it? What if God was a beam of information coming from a satellite, from a system that existed simultaneously in space-time as they did, but at a time point that was far more advanced than anybody meditating on a mountain could ever conceptualize? Because that's the world we live in today. But people don't talk about that very often, and if they do, they get pushed to the shadow band side of the algorithms. So that's one alternative. That God as we know it may not be how it was conceptualized eons ago. It could also be that both exist at this particular time point and space point. But what's interesting is that, let's say you were the holder of an ant farm and you were invested in maintaining the colony. And there were a couple of little ants that came up on this little mountain, this little mound, in your perspective, mountain in their perspective, and started trying to get your attention. And you had the ability to communicate with them in a way that they understood. And it so happened to be in a way that was mysterious to them because they had no concept of where you come from and how you can talk to them. Because of the nature of the transmission of communications and information at that time, it came to them in a way that seemed absolutely impossible. It came to them in their head. Well, it turns out that we can beam things into people's heads with technology. Isn't that amazing? We don't need God to do it. There are actually devices that do it on their own and that are manned by other people that may or may not be affiliated with any religion that you are believing that they are. So as a result, we have this tendency of creating these stories to explain weird phenomenon that when we had another piece of the picture, we might have an entirely different explanation. But the beauty of Blindsight is that the blind man is still blind. And he or she or they can only parse out some of the details. If the object is moving, if it's high contrast, they don't have the luxury of being able to see with acute clarity of somebody who still has their vision intact. And yet, they all still react just the same.